Welcome to the program. Hernando De Soto and his army of 500 or so men in the waning days of 1540 were in their third year in a land that they called Florida, which on the maps accounted for a massive chunk of North America north of Mexico. They first landed in the Tampa Bay area in May of 1539, and from there made their way to modern-day eastern Tennessee and then to central Alabama. Along the way, they invaded regional mound-building chiefdoms, kidnapped or extracted through threats men and women to take as slaves and keep in chains. All the while, De Soto made Adelantado, a governor with enhanced powers and interests in their domain by the King of Spain, was supposed to conquer 200 leagues of coastline and build 3 stone forts to protect 2 to 3 settlements. Instead, De Soto went inland, built no settlements and no fortifications. If you listen to the last 2 episodes on De Soto, then you already know that De Soto is not interested in the safe, dull type of colonization that the king had in mind. He had no intention of felling trees and tilling the land. De Soto was a veteran of the Spanish conquest of the Inca. Experience told him that on these mysterious continents, gold and silver could be found inland, perhaps in the high mountains, and great native empires might be found with settled, subservient populations. And if you could knock the top off of their hierarchy, you could have a ready-made colony for the king and riches beyond imagination for yourself. It was his share of the loot taken from the Inca that made him one of the richest men in the world and financed this colonization endeavor, along with the fortunes of many of his family and extended network of friends. And 2 years in, he has nothing to show for it except for the death of a little more than 100 of his people. And after the Battle of Mabila, as we saw in our last episode, the death of thousands of natives. This was the bloodiest battle on what would become American soil until the Civil War, which likely ended the Tuscaloosa Paramount Chiefdom, the third large Mississippian chiefdom visited by the Spanish in 1540. Each one diminished by De Soto's presence. With 2 years gone by and nothing to show for it, we might at this point label De Soto a failure. And yet, in comparison to previous Spanish governors, he's actually doing pretty well. The first Adelantado, Ponce de Leon, is injured by the natives soon after hitting the beaches of Florida, makes a hasty retreat, and dies slowly of infection in Cuba. Lucas Vasquez de Ayan lives about 3 months in the land of Chicora, off the east coast of the United States today, dies, and his colony falls into a state of anarchy. Only a quarter or so of his colonists make it back to the Caribbean. After that, Panfilo de Narvaez dies within a year of his landing. Of the 300 men who went inland with him, only 4 made their way to Mexico to tell the tale. De Soto has outlived all of these men combined in their tenure. And picking up on the tale, he finds himself entering the winter of 1540-41 at a fork in the road. He knows his ships are harboring around what is today Pensacola. He could easily trek there in a week or so and receive the latest news of the empire, start a small settlement there and build a reasonable fort, sail to Cuba for resupply, or to recruit more families for settlement. Instead, he gambles on the chance of glory and will leave central Alabama, marching the Spanish, their chain gang of slaves, and herds of livestock to the northwest, deeper into the continent, severing his last potential lifeline with the outside world. Their first obstacle being the Black Warrior River, where the Spanish struggled to find a crossing point, and from the other side, a group of native warriors taunted them. If you listen to the last episode, you will know that De Soto's response to a dare, trap, or insult is to walk straight into it and then out of it again victoriously. So, he has his men construct a boat secretly out of view of the natives, then ferries men across, where the natives, seeing the arrows bounce off the Spanish armor, flee. Once across the river on December 2nd, 1540, the Spanish reached the village of Apafalaya, and in a time-honored move at this point, he takes the local chief hostage in order to extract food from the natives and guarantee the safety of De Soto and his people. De Soto is the protagonist of this story. He's not the hero. You don't have to like him. They spend about a week here, using up the resources before moving on and running into the Tombigbee River, where again, the natives on the other side taunt the Spanish. This time, however, De Soto sent a native envoy over to speak to them. That poor soul was promptly killed on the spot. Now De Soto is angry and finds a crossing, and again the natives run away. And by mid-December of 1540, De Soto reaches the native village of Chickaza, somewhere near Columbus, Mississippi today. They and their neighbors being ancestors to the Chickasaw people. Here, the Spanish arrive, and as would often happen, the village is already abandoned upon their approach, which meant that the food stores were plentiful, and De Soto decides it is here that he will overwinter. The Spanish go about tearing apart the structures of the small village to create a makeshift dwelling for themselves and their large caravan of people. The Chickasaw quickly realize these strangers aren't just passing through, but they intend to stay a while, and they start attacking the Spanish in small raids, trying to coax them into leaving. De Soto has his men capture 2 warriors, and through a chain of interpreters, tells one man that he will be set free, and that he could tell his chief to come to the village in return for the second man. Surprisingly, and very bravely, the chief does present himself to De Soto, arriving on a litter carried by servants with gifts, including 150 dead rabbits, along with a few lesser chiefs, including the chief of the village of Alabama, which we will see in a moment. De Soto, for his part, doesn't seize this man, likely not wanting to incense the natives further while camped in their area for the winter. After this, the attacks stop, and De Soto is able to call upon the chief whenever he is needed. They have an uneasy understanding. The Chickasaw chief likely sensed that De Soto might feel somewhat indebted to his people, whose village he was occupying, and sometime in early 1541, the chief asks De Soto for a favor, to participate in an attack on the village of Sheshuma. Now, the people of this village, seeing that the Chickasaw chief was dispossessed, no longer felt the need to pay this chief tribute, and now he wanted revenge. De Soto actually agrees to a combined attack on the village. The people of Sheshuma, seeing their enemy approach with a detachment of hairy, pale-faced men dressed in metal, some riding on large deer-like creatures, obviously fled their own village into the woods. The Chickasaw took their revenge by burning the village to the ground. The chief of the Sheshuma appeared and submitted to the chief of the Chickasaw, and a great feast was held in honor of their swift victory. The Spanish provided the pork, which the natives liked, and in the nights after the battle, the Spanish hogs were stolen from the Spanish herds at Chickasaw. A number of the natives were caught in the act, and their hands were cut off. Then, 4 Spaniards took it upon themselves to go to the village of Chickazilla, where the Chickasaw chief took refuge, and stole the pelts from the people there. This incident could have easily begun a winter-long war, but De Soto arrests the 4 Spaniards, confiscates their possessions, and ultimately has 2 of them executed, 2 of his own men. This is far more generous than he has been in past episodes. And he would have killed the other 2 if not for the interpreter, Juan Ortiz, who lied, and he told De Soto that the natives wished the last 2 men to be saved. Clearly they did not, as the accounts the Spaniards left say otherwise. This kept the peace until early March of 1541, when De Soto tells the Chickasaw chief that the Spanish were going to depart his land. The chief must have felt the weight lifting off his chest. This was good news. But then, De Soto requests that he be provided 200 burden carriers. And as the natives would have witnessed over the last winter, the natives taken in the last episode of this show from places like Tuscaloosa or the Coosa were kept in chains, and they were made to carry heavy weights. And as you can imagine, their mortality rate was quite high. This was not a condition that the Chickasaw wanted to see their people in. As we've seen over the last 2 episodes, a burden carrier is underfed, underdressed, overworked, and kept in chains. And, in fact, over the winter, his old carriers, taken from the people of Appalachia onward, died in massive proportion, and so De Soto wanted them replaced. The chief, seeing the condition of these burden carriers, had no intention of handing over his people to such a fate. The Spanish record that they sensed a bit of hesitation from the chief. Nevertheless, De Soto insisted on obtaining the burden carriers. The chief arranged for 300 people to arrive at Chickasaw, But instead of submitting to enslavement, they set fire to their own village and began murdering the Spanish, killing 12 people, 57 horses, and 400 pigs. A good deal of the supplies were also lost in the fires. In this ruinous state, the Spanish buried their dead, heal their wounds, eat their dead horses and pigs, and instead of living in the rubble of Chickaza, they marched to the village of Chickazilla. The natives fled, and the Spanish here construct a forge, repair their weapons, and make new lances, just in time to fight out the combined Chickaza and Chickazilla for a final time. They now remain here until the end of April. The Spanish then depart to the northwest, and they find an abandoned village of the Alabama people. Their warriors are found nearby, perhaps as many as 300 of them, held up in a square palisade, in full war paint, beating their drums. De Soto insists on attacking this fortification. Historians often criticize this decision because there's no strategic reason to attack the Alabama. The Spanish had their food stores. The natives offered no challenge or impediment to their travel. Nevertheless, De Soto has his men divide up into 3 companies for a full frontal assault of the palisade, where the Alabama unleash a wall of arrows so thick it found the gaps in the armor of many of the men, and De Soto himself took an arrow right to his helmet, which caused him to see stars. Still, the Spanish breached the palisade wall, only to discover that the fort had 2 more inner walls, and on the very far end, a very narrow bridge spanning a river. The natives fled the fort over the bridge before the Spanish could cut them down. De Soto had at this point managed some impressive victories over the natives, but in this case, 30 of his men were injured, 15 of which would die over the next few days. Meanwhile, the Spanish could only confirm the deaths of 3 Alabama warriors. Chalk that one up for the Alabama. The Spanish then occupied the fort, which contained no food, no supplies of any sort. The entire endeavor was a pointless waste of time. From across the river, a native archer gestured to a Spanish crossbowman in such a manner as the Spanish understood he wished to have a one-on-one duel, the challenge being common in both cultures. The 2 men waded into their respective sides of the river. The native arrow struck the Spaniard on the ear and neck. The Spanish bolt pierced the native square in the chest. The Spaniard recovered, the native likely not. After his army healed, De Soto was quick to continue to the northwest, not stopping until he reached the village of Quizquiz, likely near the northwestern corner of Mississippi today, where De Soto, without provocation, takes captive everyone he can in the village, everyone he could grab upon his approach. The chief of the Quizquiz organizes a military response to rid his village of the Spanish, and the 2 sides face off against one another in a long standoff within a crossbow range of one another, for what the Spanish record to be a half an hour, only broken when the natives send forward men with furs as gifts. The Spanish request canoes to cross the river west of the village, perhaps the Mississippi River, and be on their way. De Soto figured such a request to expedite their leaving the local area would go over well. However, the warriors dispersed, and neither came back to attack, nor came with canoes, leaving the Spanish somewhat bewildered. They move on from Quizquiz and decide to build their own boats to cross the river. Then on May 22nd, 1541, 200 large dugout canoes holding what the accounts estimate to be 7,000 native warriors approach the Spanish camp along the river. The commander of this great fleet is recorded by the Spanish as the chief of the Aquilo, and he approaches in his canoe, and surprisingly, he asks De Soto, what does De Soto need to complete his boats? De Soto beckoned the chief to the land, keen on taking the chief hostage. This man who could command 7,000 warriors could be quite useful. The chief, being no fool, retreated, and the Spanish shot their crossbows at the canoes as the natives fled. It would take almost a month to finish the boats, all the while being taunted by these natives on the river, seemingly having regular patrols. The Spanish responded to these threats by digging foxholes and having their own guards, as these warriors would occasionally shoot arrows. But then, the day before the boats were completed, the natives informed the Spanish that they would not stop the Spanish from crossing. De Soto, nonetheless, has the Spanish cross what was probably the Mississippi River once again, 3 hours before dawn to avoid unwanted attention. Finding on the other side the abandoned village of Chief Aquilo, the Spanish went about capturing natives from the countryside and learned of a nearby village named Pacaha, whose chief had participated in the flotilla of canoes with Chief Aquilo. The captive told the Spanish that the Pacaha were enemies of another group of people called the Casqui. De Soto decided to travel to the Casqui, hoping the enemy of his enemy would become his friend. And fortunately for the Spanish, as they walked through the country of the Casqui, they were greeted with gifts along the way, until finally the chief presented himself along the road. He told De Soto that he knew the Spanish were coming from the afterlife, and that they could rest in his village. It was not uncommon for Native Americans, upon seeing white people for the very first time, to at least consider, due to their paleness, that these strangers might be the dead returning to this realm. Such thoughts usually dissipated very quickly, unless the Europeans involved found cause to encourage such beliefs. De Soto did not quite trust the chief of the Casqui and set up camp just outside the village. The chief then brought a large group of people to look at these strangers. They bow before De Soto, and a blind man is brought before De Soto to be healed. De Soto told the chief that only his lord, who had died and come back to life and ascended into heaven, could perform such feats. The chief then asked De Soto to then bring the rain, as the people were living through a drought, or if he could not, provide the chief with a sign or symbol that he could then use to ensure victory in a war or battle. De Soto, usually very quick on his feet, asks the chief to return tomorrow, and he could perform some of these requests. The next day, the chief returns in tears, explaining that the drought had persisted for so long his people were now without food. De Soto's only solution was to rely on the Christian God to show grace upon these people, and he has a large cross constructed and placed on the highest mound in the village. Then the natives marched around the cross, singing their songs to the sky. The Spanish, too, then responded with their Catholic chants, prayers, and songs. Two cultures with only a tenuous ability to communicate with one another, understanding precisely what they were collectively trying to do. Then late into the night, wouldn't you know it, it started to rain. Taking this as a sign of God's grace, De Soto then proposed that the two people enter an alliance and attack the Pacaha if need be. The chief agrees, and both groups prepare for a joint invasion. On June 27th, 1541, their combined forces amassed outside of Pacaha. They send word to the chief of the town that if allowed, the Spanish and the Casqui will enter their town in peace, the implication being that they would be coming in regardless, so it may as well be without violence. Upon hearing this, the people of the Pacaha tried to flee, causing the Casqui to rush forward and attack, taking captives and freeing the Casqui captives among them. The Spanish marched into the village to support their ally. De Soto even tried to subdue the Casqui a bit, at least, in their fury. The Casqui climbed the funereal mound of the Pacaha, entered the temple, and ripped apart the bodies of the chief's dead family, broke their bones, and put their heads on pikes. Both allies then feasted on the food the villagers had left behind, and the Spanish found fine pelts for which they crafted new clothing. You can imagine the condition of their old linen shirts after 2.5 years. The Spanish were quite happy with this current conquest. But the Casqui, however, not so satisfied. They chased down the fleeing people of Pacaha and found them taking refuge on a nearby island in the Mississippi River. They called upon the Spanish, and the two armies used Casqui canoes to reach the island, where the Pacaha once again flee in their own canoes. The Casqui then filled their canoes with all the food and goods that the Pacaha left behind. Preparing to depart, the Spanish feared that the Casqui intended to strand them on the island. De Soto rushed forward and had a number of his own allied Casqui taken hostage to ensure the canoes would ferry his men back to the mainland. The Casqui ferry his men back and insist that the incident was just a misunderstanding. But De Soto himself is somewhat skeptical, and the Spanish separately now seek out the chief of the Pacaha for a meeting. This chief appears and immediately submits to De Soto's authority. He presents gifts from the meager stores the Pacajá still retained. De Soto then presents the chief with the remains that the Spanish could gather of his ancestors and family from the desecrated mound of the village. De Soto, then presenting this in front of the chief, proposes to the chief of the Pacajá an alliance against the Casqui. Then, the next day, the chief of the Casqui presents himself before De Soto to apologize for the actions of his warriors. He brings De Soto gifts and his own daughter for De Soto to take in marriage. His people then bowed down before De Soto and begged forgiveness. Every one of them had painted on them the sign of the cross, the symbol De Soto taught them to bring the rain. De Soto forgives them, and now suddenly he is a paramount chief of sorts over his own people and two groups of natives who aren't fond of each other, but now keep a testy peace under his leadership. Strange days indeed, and only getting stranger. The chief of the Pacajá, not to be outdone by the people who destroyed his village and put the heads of his dead relatives on display, quickly gave De Soto one of his own wives and one of his sisters to take on as further brides. Here we reach another fork in the road for De Soto. At the beginning of this episode, he chose not to seek out his boats and instead go further into the interior of the continent. Now, De Soto, quite suddenly, has a subservient, settled population and potentially 3 wives, which would weave his offspring into the clans of the local ruling class of 2 different peoples. In an alternative timeline, De Soto would settle down and begin a mestizo population in what today would be northeast Arkansas, western Tennessee. But we know De Soto better than this by now. He's restless, and he's invested too much of his own wealth and the fortune and lives of his friends and family to not sail out of North America with a return on those investments in gold and silver. This would be unacceptable. The Spanish remain here for a time, but send scouts out in every direction, seeking opportunities. Not one returns with anything interesting, which underscores something going on inside De Soto, which I can't say for sure. But in our last 2 episodes, De Soto is following up on rumors of gold and silver, often embellished by natives, to get the Spanish out of their towns and onto somewhere else. And he finds chiefdoms with some amount of these precious things, but the chiefs considered rich in gold among the natives of the East Coast had a tiny fraction of the gold of a single native leader in the Andes or in Central America. And so, even if the natives weren't completely lying about these rumors of gold, they simply had a different sense of scale as to how much gold was a lot of gold. Also, the natives on the East Coast were just beginning to enter the Copper Age, to use an old world term. They did not necessarily have a different word for gold and copper. Copper being plentiful in the Great Lakes and were traded out to the rest of the continent. The 2 metals could be found in many of the same ores, they have similar properties, and copper was far more plentiful. So either by hook or crook, these were the reports that De Soto was following up upon. But now, De Soto clearly had no intention of building his own coastal colony as ordered by the king. He doesn't want to set up shop with the Casqui or the Pacajá, and he has no favorable reports to investigate in any direction of any rumored golden empire. And yet he decides to go on. Without getting too flippant about our star here, he has the behavior of a degenerate gambler at this point. Specifically, De Soto is the guy who hit it big young, made a lot of money early in his gambling career, in Central and South America specifically. This actually happened to him, and so figured this would be the rate of his wins in the future. You may know such a person. I have. And so, the Spanish depart here, walking through what will one day be the state of Arkansas. And along the way, the Spanish lived through repeats of the past, more of the same, empty villages, chiefs hiding in the woods. In one case, a fake chief came forward and was later found out. But De Soto burns through the summer of 1541 and now has to find a place to overwinter yet again. In early September, the Spanish invade a territory of a people that they refer to as the Caligua, and they managed to take the chief captive, who reigned paramount over a large number of villages. The Spanish could now extract food, and from here they particularly enjoyed the roasted pumpkins. But De Soto's decision-making is now entering survival mode. The Caligua are easily subdued, but they don't have the resources to last the Spanish through the winter. And so, when asked, the Caligua tell the Spanish of a richer land to the west, occupied by the Cayas people, and another land to the north, with few people, but many large, wild cow-like creatures. The Spanish discern to be a buffalo, a different creature than the American bison that we know today, but we can't fault the Spanish for misidentification based on a native description alone. And once again, De Soto is off. If you were a native group at the time, the shorter the Spanish occupied your territory, the better. They went west, not interested in cow country. The Spanish traveled to the land of the Cayas, likely upstream on the Arkansas River from Little Rock today. The Cayas indeed had more corn than the previous group, and used the salt springs to harvest salt for trade. Still, this isn't enough for De Soto. He coaxes the local chief out of hiding on promise that he will leave his land if he were to just tell him where he could find a more populated area that could sustain his people through the winter. This chief, just as the last, points De Soto further west, to the land of the Tula. Understandably, De Soto becomes suspicious of this information, having fallen for this same tactic time and time again for several years. So, he himself leads a detachment to Tula with 50 foot soldiers and 13 horsemen to investigate the region himself in person, while the remainder of the Spanish kept the Cayas under their boot heels. De Soto, with the smaller force, find Tula, and while women and children flee upon their approach, the men immediately attacked. And when the Spanish organized a forward assault, the natives would fall back. Another group of them would appear and attack from the rear. De Soto held his men together, but became so unintimidating to the Tula, the women joined the fight. Still, the Spanish killed 15 of them without losses of their own, aside from some wounds, and De Soto had his men grab a few of the attackers and managed to occupy the village. He then took 6 of the Tula warriors and had their right hands cut off, as well as their noses. He then requested that these men return to their chief and demand he submit himself before the Spanish. But De Soto had traveled so far west, he had a new problem on his hands. In the first episode of this De Soto series, the Spanish were surprised to run into a Spaniard living among the Timucuan people. His name was Juan Ortiz. This man knew the Timucuan language, and later native captives from Appalachia knew some of this language and the various Muskogean dialects. To make up a large portion of the American Southeast, this chain of interpreters served the needs of De Soto quite well, with a few misunderstandings along the way. Now, however, the Tula people likely spoke a Caddo dialect, a family of languages ranging from Texas to the Dakotas, and his chain of interpreters simply did not link around this new linguistic region. So he communicated to the mutilated captives his demands through gestures, that in addition to the chief, they should send someone who could speak the Cayas language, because he had some people from there. The Tula chief sent 20 people, among them a single man who managed to speak to some of the captive Cayas, which is exactly what De Soto was looking for. Now consider the chain of communication here. Like a game of telephone, it might be 4 or 5 people deep. Spanish to Timucuan to the Muskogean dialects, perhaps Appalachia to Hittichi to the Upper Creek to Choctaw, who knows? But however the words traveled, the Tula man gave a grand speech begging for De Soto's forgiveness. For what, I have no idea, and De Soto requests again that the chief come to him, which he did 3 days later with 80 warriors and a gift of bison hides, which the Spanish found impressive in their size. The Spanish record that the people here practiced head deformation and had even more tattoos on their faces and bodies than the previous groups they had encountered. De Soto, again, not impressed with the domain of the Tula, asks the chief, again, where he could find a region that would have more people to support his army over winter. The chief pointed to the southeast and said that the people of Utayanqui were greater in population than his own. De Soto gathers his own people together, releases the Cayuse chief and the Tula captives, and he leaves for Utayanqui, which meant he was actually heading back east, although a little further south than upon his approach, but still in the general area of Little Rock today. During their travels, a few warriors shoot arrows at the Spanish from the woods, but there's no organized resistance. They arrive at Utayanqui to find it recently abandoned, but luckily for them, they found a sufficient store of corn. It's the beginning of November of 1541, and De Soto decides this is the best he's going to find for a winter camp. Seeing the placid nature of the Cayuse and the Utayanqui compared to the Tula, it becomes pretty clear in hindsight that the Cayuse sent De Soto to the Tula not for food, but to be killed by their most aggressive neighbor. That's my takeaway anyway. At Utayanqui, De Soto has a palisade constructed around the town, and he uses the people he enslaved to go about the countryside and collect firewood and forage for food. He had taken these natives so long ago and so far away from their homes, they had no affinity for the people who lived nearby, nor any idea of where they were. And so reportedly, none of them ran away. An uneventful winter, except it is here that Juan Ortiz becomes ill and dies, thus severing his most reliable link in De Soto's chain of communication with the natives. Now, he had to rely on a captive young native boy who knew a decent amount of Spanish at this point. This underscores the fact that De Soto's chain of interpreters was perhaps only one man thick. Instead of several people at each link in the chain, the line of communication was just that thin. And now, communication depended solely on the goodwill of native captives to report accurately what people were saying to the Spanish, ultimately funneling down to just a single child. The Spanish leave their winter camp in March of 1542, having less people, less resources, and less hope than on any previous spring. They travel to the southeast, finding village after village abandoned. The people forewarned of the Spanish over the long winter. They go about a month and a half before they enter a country where people could easily be taken by surprise. This would be the village of Gauchoa in modern-day southeast Arkansas along the Mississippi River. De Soto has the local chief submit to his authority, and his horsemen scout the countryside, finding nothing that excites De Soto's imagination. Finally, De Soto, publicly, to his fellow Spaniards, contemplates a way to make contact with the coast in hope that his ships, last known to be at Pensacola in 1540, might still be around, in order to finally extract the Spanish from so-called Spanish Florida. He figured, even if the ships were gone, his men could build rafts, as it seemed the river nearby took a southward course. From there, they could raft to Mexico, although that didn't work out so well for his predecessor, Panfilo de Narvaez. Furthermore, this region is full of small warring groups. The Mississippi River itself, outside of the village he's occupying, is patrolled by enemy groups who shoot arrows at the men when given the chance. And yet, despite all of these groups, none of them are large enough to be a prize for the Spanish. The prospects for leaving were as dim as staying. Nonetheless, in early May of 1542, De Soto is persuaded by the Gauchoas to attack the nearby village of Anilco, enemies of the Gauchoa. De Soto falls ill and is unable to participate, but the Spanish and the Gauchoas take the Anilco by surprise, and the Gauchoas were so brutal in their attacks, even the Spanish found it shocking. The Gauchoas spared no one. They killed women by shooting arrows into their private areas and threw babies into the air to use as target practice. Such acts are a testament to how long the struggles existed between these two peoples. Often natives seek to adopt women and children of their enemies taken in war. It would only make themselves stronger in the long run. So hateful had their conflict become before the Spanish even arrived that the Gauchoas saw now no benefit into absorbing any part of the Anilco. It was a sad victory, but it served to display the power of the combined Spanish Gauchoas. De Soto now followed up this victory by demanding the chief of the nearby Quilqualtum, who controlled the riverway from the other side, submit to De Soto's command. He tells this chief that he is the son of the sun, a powerful being not to be crossed. The chief tells De Soto that if he is indeed the son of the sun, he should dry up the Mississippi to demonstrate his powers. This exchange is done through messengers, and the chief possibly wasn't buying De Soto's shtick, because De Soto was now very visibly ill and likely did not appear to be a semi-divine figure to these messengers, who we can assume gave their impressions to the chief himself. So bad was his condition that on May 20th, 1542, De Soto tells the men to elect among themselves a new leader. His men, out of respect, request he instead appoints his own successor while he still lived. De Soto chooses Luis de Moscoso, an accomplished conquistador in his own right, a decent cavalryman, and a master of camp when De Soto would divide his forces. The men approve of De Soto's pick and went ahead and held a vote confirming Moscoso. A day later, De Soto, having completely failed his people for the last 3 years and responsible for the deaths of thousands, dies himself. Now, the Spanish have another problem. Some of the natives, like the chief of the Gauchoyas, still believed De Soto to be a powerful being. Moscoso doesn't want them to know that De Soto had died, so they bury him quickly. But the natives begin visiting the camp, inspecting the overturned ground, and they have some questions. So Moscoso has the Spanish undig De Soto's body, and the reports vary, but De Soto was either placed in a hollow log or weighed down with blankets and sand, and then either way, secretly at night, put in the Mississippi River. And thus ends the story of Hernando De Soto, once one of the richest men in Spain and perhaps the world. Now, Moscoso held an auction to liquidate De Soto's estate, which had dwindled down to 4 enslaved individuals, 3 horses, and 700 pigs. Everyone could bid with the promise of future payment were they to make it out of so-called Spanish Florida alive, and the proceeds would go towards his inheritors and creditors. So a meager estate for his widow in Cuba, who would likely lose all of it to the creditors. The chief of the Gauchoyas inquired as to where De Soto had gone. Moscoso told him that De Soto had returned to the sky, which he did from time to time, and it was nothing to be concerned about. It was clear to the Spanish it was time to leave the area and head for Mexico. The men decide to try to go overland, as De Vaca had done, and maybe along the way, they still might find a golden empire to plunder somewhere in the far west. The men depart, and they find that all the villages again in a westward direction were abandoned upon their approach. A scattering of natives along the way report a large body of water nearby. This excites the Spaniards, as they thought it might be the Pacific Ocean, and maybe they were closer to Mexico than they thought. In reality, they were just in southwestern Arkansas. Not everyone felt a sudden jolt of optimism, however. One man, Francisco de Guzman, gambled away his Native American wife in a bet. Having a sudden change of priorities, Francisco and his wife went missing that very night and were never seen again by the Spanish. Which sends us tilting towards the end of July, where the Spanish make their way to the land of the Naugatucks, likely another Caddo-speaking group. The Spanish terrorize the population until they are given guides to take them further westward, who manage to get the Spanish all the way to the Ayas people living in East Texas, which may have been an intentional move on the part of the natives who led them there, because the Ayas people attacked the Spanish without hesitation. In a battle the Spanish record as lasting almost an entire day. The Spanish received wounds, but no deaths. The Ayas suffered many deaths, but were unrelenting. The Spanish withdrew from this area quickly. And then the Spanish spent most of the hot August summer of 1542 wandering Texas. They see their first bison along the way, but otherwise, they sense that they are being led in circles by their guides. Moscoso interrogates an old man who seems to have taken a lead among these guides. The man admits that his chief ordered him to march the Spanish around the western wastelands until the Spanish starved to death. Moscoso, in a rage, threw the old man to his attack dogs, who tore the man apart and ate his remains. Now truly rudderless, they eventually wander into the village of Gawaasco, which was rich in corn, and the natives here seem to have had some familiarity with the Spanish, which seemed like a hopeful indication that Mexico was near. However, the anthropologist Dr. Charles Hudson points out, Cabeza de Vaca had come through this very same area in just the decade prior. He also suggests that because the Spanish were being led in circles, they may be hearing tales and reports from the natives that were merely earlier sightings of their own group. The Spanish were now truly bewildered. They found the Caddo peoples of Texas few in number, spread out, materially poor, living in a dry environment without mineral riches, doing far too much hunting, not enough farming to support the needs of the Spanish. Moscoso took a vote of the men, who decided to do an about-face and return to the Mississippi River and raft down the coast after all. Moving into the fall of 1542, the men take the desperate trek back east. The weather grew colder, wetter, disease suddenly broke out among them. Only hastening their desperate pace, men started dying at a rate not seen before among De Soto's people. Occasionally, the natives would ambush the stragglers. The men were racing against the oncoming winter, the stalking natives, and their own mortality. But believe it or not, they actually make it back to the Mississippi, where they take over the village of Aminoya, on the river near the border of Arkansas and Mississippi today, surrounded by a number of villages like the Otangui and the Gawachoyas, who already knew this group of Spaniards well and feared them less than ever. But the village had 9,000 bushels of corn and was about the best spot they were going to find to use as a base to build their rafts to head back to Mexico. The countryside had fine trees for lumber, and the men melted down their metal buckles and other objects to make nails, including the chains that they finally removed from the people they enslaved. As the winter came on, the men shed the last vestiges of their Spanish clothing and adopted thick native fur coats. In the dead of the season, the work seems to have grind to a halt, and in early 1543, the natives start visiting the Spanish. With such frequency, Moscoso becomes suspicious of their intentions, as they appear to be assessing the Spanish condition. He takes a few captive and tortures them. One man finally broke and told Moscoso of a coalition of 20 chiefs who were conspiring to amass their warriors in one unified attack on the Spanish. The plan was for the natives to start bringing the Spanish fish for 2 days to lull the Spanish into a false sense of security. And then on the third day, the men bringing the fish would set fire to the village, signaling the native coalition to attack. His story was confirmed when indeed the natives came one day with gifts of fish. Moscoso seized the men and had their right hands and noses cut off, and then sent them back to their people with the message that the natives are welcome to attack whenever they wished. Instead of an attack, 3 native chiefs came forward to apologize. The chief of the Gayachoa, the Taquanate, and the Anilco. The Gayachoa chief, being a former friend of the Spanish, told Moscoso that the other 2 chiefs had no intention of abandoning their planned attack. Moscoso, having no reason to trust any of them, tests the Gayachoa chief, handing over the other 2 to him and commanding Chief Gayachoa to kill them, which he does. Perhaps Moscoso read his Caesar, not the inventor of the idea, but a proponent of divide and conquer. The rafts were not finished until June of 1543. One reason these took so long to construct is that these weren't the rough, mostly sunken platforms that Narvaez and company constructed several years before, but rather than call them rafts, as I have been, the vessels are referred to in the most generous terms in sources as brigantines. So we could say that the Spanish here at least made an attempt at a legitimate boat that could navigate both the river and the coast, with some semblance of a sail and rigging, and the construction of these were led by a single Spanish Basque ship carpenter who just happened to be part of De Soto's expedition, which was far better than Narvaez ever had. So they have a pretty good chance here. 7 of these vessels were constructed. What remained of the large stockpile of corn was loaded onto the ships. The hogs and most of the ever-loyal horses that they traveled with over the last 4 years were killed and salted for the trip. And the over 500 people taken slave along the way were left on the banks of the Mississippi. Many, believe it or not, cried at the Spanish sailing away. These people so far from home were now at the mercy of the local natives, for which many of them could not communicate nor had any relation. For the Spanish, this meant giving up the one tangible asset they acquired in this endeavor. These 500 or so people were gradually divided up among the Spanish as they crossed North America. Each Spaniard had to set free these poor souls and accept the fact that it was more important to make it home alive than die a man with a handful of slaves. They had to accept that this entire venture was indeed a complete loss. Except for Moscoso, of course, who managed to sneak a few of the people he enslaved onto his boat among the 322 remaining Spaniards. They sailed downstream and pillaged 2 villages back to back. Unsurprisingly, the natives take to the river in their canoes to drive off the Spanish, who are now attacked relentlessly. So persistently were the attacks that the men could not stop for rest for 2 days and had to carefully navigate the river straight through the night. One boat of Spaniards resorted to wrapping themselves in their sleeping mats just to deflect the native arrows. A few men die over the course of this days-long roving river battle, but the Spanish managed to make it clear of the natives. And in 19 or 20 days, after first departing, they reached the Gulf. Now, the men had another choice, hopefully the last they will have to make before reaching Mexico. Do they sail the open ocean in an attempt to make a direct route, or do they ride the bowl of the coastline? They resolve to try to sail directly for a bit, but they run out of fresh water. Luckily, they make it back to the coast in time to replenish. After this, they set out at sea by day over the horizon, out of view of any natives. Then at night, they return to the coast to find fresh water, fish, hunt birds, and search for shellfish. And after 53 days, the men reached the Spanish settlement of Panuco in New Spain, modern-day Mexico, on September 10th, 1543. 311 men in total. They kissed the ground and they prayed to God. The local mayor took them in. They were reportedly bone-thin, sun-baked, and overwhelmingly angry with one another. In the coming days, the finger-pointing began as to who was to blame for every little mistake over the last 4 years. One complaint, in hindsight, was how simple it had turned out to be to sail to Mexico. Those who voted against doing so earlier now had targets on their back, and several murders occurred. The mayor, unable to deal with the hundreds of angry men, told the Viceroy of New Spain of his troubles, and the Viceroy ordered the men to march to Mexico City in small groups composed of men who get along with one another. The men had no choice but to begin walking to Mexico City. The Viceroy orders the towns along the way to support the men. Even with this, several more murders are committed. From here, the men ultimately dispersed throughout the Spanish New World. At Veracruz, a few of the men ran into the captains of De Soto's boats from 1539 and learned that they faithfully brought the boats to Pensacola every year from 1540 to 1543, where they forged relationships with the local natives and sent out word in search of De Soto. In other words, they realized their quick extraction from so-called Spanish Florida was an option on the table every year of their suffering, had they simply sought out the prearranged rendezvous point. The captains here learn of De Soto's demise, and now would fulfill their duty and travel to Havana to deliver the sad news to De Soto's widow, acting governor of Cuba, serving in place of her husband. Soon to be out of a job and partnerless, she quickly sells everything she can and moves back to Spain. And with this, it brings us to the legacy portion of the podcast. What can we make of anything that happened over the last 3 episodes? What can we say about De Soto? Let's be generous and start with some good, or at least some interesting things. De Soto and his men cover somewhere around 4,000 miles over the course of their wanderings. providing the earliest written record in many cases of different Native American groups and the words they use, their customs. Along the way, a few of the pigs went feral and introduced a new animal to the East Coast, a new source of food for the natives. Okay, that's what we have here for potential positives. Let's get a little deeper here now. De Soto, as mentioned in our last episode, began a period of time known as the Mississippian Shatter Zone, sparking the decline of the mound-building chiefdoms of North America, both by his direct actions and the introduction of old-world diseases left in his wake. The massive amounts of death would alter the demographics of North America. De Soto also shed a few of his own people along the way. Their integration or effect on the native population is not knowable, but could be more than nothing, perhaps contributing to the gene pool, not to mention any offspring of the non-consensual relationships by the men in his army with native women. Perhaps children were created then. And of his survivors, who didn't settle in Spanish Florida, but largely settled in the New World, their stories and their paths were altered by having joined De Soto. Undoubtedly, they are the ancestors to many in Latin America today. It is worth noting that had De Soto made a simple settlement in Appalachia in 1539, he would have never found riches. But with a 68-year head start over Jamestown, all of North America today may have been Latin America. And in this alternative history, De Soto would be remembered as a figure equaling John Smith, the Plymouth settlers, Samuel de Champlain, Henry Hudson, Peter Stuyvesant, or Stuyvesant, however you want to say it, all put together. His greatest strength in this regard simply being that he lived before all these other figures. 1540 is not far from 1492. A boy in Spain could have read of Columbus's first voyage and easily lived long enough to pick up an account of De Soto. Importantly for this season of the show, De Soto's ragtag group of survivors signaled to the Viceroy of New Spain that the governorship of Spanish Florida might be back on the market. And in our next episode, we will see an attempt to settle Florida come from the direction of Mexico, not Europe. If you survived my rambling account of De Soto, I would appreciate a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this. I'm Eric Yanis. Until next time, this has been the Other States of America History Podcast. Thank you for listening.